She left me before our anniversary, out of the blue. It is all still very fresh, and I still do not really understand what happened, and even as I try to write this down, it feels like I am only scratching the surface of something that is much bigger and heavier than I can fully process right now, because everything that happened between us did not feel like something that was slowly ending, but rather like something that was very alive one moment, and then suddenly, no longer there the next. We were in a long-distance relationship, but despite the physical distance between us, it was generally a very sweet and emotionally present relationship where we tried to stay connected in every possible small way that we could manage, and she was a part of my daily routine, just as much as I was part of hers. Even if we were not physically in the same place, every day we would do light video calls that were not forced or heavy, but instead very natural and comforting, where we would just talk about random things, share parts of our day, laugh about small stuff, and simply exist in each other's presence, even through a screen. And every morning she would send me a good morning voice message, and I would do the same for her. And over time it became something that felt almost essential, like a small ritual that kept us grounded to each other no matter what else was happening in our lives. During the day, we constantly exchanged messages, where we told each other, "I love you," sent emojis, reacted to small things in each other's day, and shared reels or posts about relationships or couples that somehow always made us feel like what we had was special and meaningful. And sometimes, we would even talk about how it felt like we were meant to be together, not in a dramatic way, but in a very natural and comforting way that made it feel like we were building something real. And even though it was long distance, it never felt empty or cold, because there was always communication, always effort, and always this sense that we were both trying to stay close in the ways that we could. Even though our relationship was generally loving and stable on the surface, she had a history of insecurity because of her past relationships, and because of that, she would sometimes get scared in ways that were not always easy for her to control or explain, and she would start to think that I might leave her one day, or that I deserve someone better than her, or she would even question why I love her at all, despite me constantly showing her that I do. Whenever those moments came, I always tried my best to stay calm, grounded, and reassuring, because I genuinely meant what I was saying to her. And I would tell her repeatedly that she is the one for me, that I am not looking for anyone else, and that I had no intention of leaving her, not now and not in the future. And I tried to make sure my words and actions matched consistently so she could feel safe with me over time. She was someone who did not fully open up easily, especially when it came to deeper emotional vulnerability. But I stayed patient and steady, trying to create a space where she did not feel judged or pressured. And even though there were moments of doubt, there were still many moments of love, warmth, and connection between us that felt very real and very mutual. At the beginning of the year, we got engaged, and that moment made her incredibly happy in a way that felt very genuine and meaningful, like something inside her relaxed for a while, as if the relationship had reached a milestone that reassured her that we were serious and committed to each other. But even after that, I could still sense that her internal doubts never fully disappeared, even if they were quieter at times. A few days before everything fell apart, she sent me a message where she said she had deep feelings for me and that I was the only man she loved and would ever love. And she also said that I had been very nurturing to her in a way that she had not experienced before. And at the time, I remember reading that message and feeling like it was one of those moments where everything between us was still strong and emotionally aligned. But then, only a few days after that, something changed in her emotional state very suddenly. She called me while she was feeling very low, and during that call, She started blaming herself heavily, saying that she is not what I deserve and that she believes she is a bad person. And the way she spoke sounded like she was emotionally overwhelmed and numb at the same time, like she could not fully understand or control what she was feeling in that moment. We stayed on the call for a while, and I tried my best to calm her down and reassure her again, speaking gently and trying to bring her back to a more stable, emotional place. And eventually she became quiet, almost exhausted, and dozed off while still on the call. And I stayed there for a bit longer, just to make sure she was okay before I eventually left the call so she could rest properly. At that time, I did not think that this would be the moment where everything would start to fall apart. The very next day after that call, she told me that she does not want this relationship anymore. She said that she wants to stay where she is currently living and does not want to continue the relationship in the same way anymore. And she also expressed that she is deeply sorry for leaving me like this, but that her mind feels completely numb and that she does not even fully understand what is happening inside her own emotions. It all came very suddenly, especially considering how normal and even loving things had been just days before, and there was no clear buildup that I could point to that explained this shift in a way that made immediate sense to me. It felt less like an argument or a gradual separation, and more like someone reaching a point of internal emotional shutdown where they could no longer continue, even if they could not fully explain why. A few days after the breakup, we met in person to exchange our belongings, and that meeting felt very different from every other time we had seen each other before, because there was no warmth in the usual sense, only distance and emotional silence that filled the space between us. She was wearing sunglasses the entire time, and her sentences were very short and minimal, almost like she was trying to get through the situation without breaking down or without having to explain anything more than necessary. And I could feel that there was a strong emotional weight behind her silence, even if she was not expressing it openly. At some point during that meeting, we hugged goodbye, and in that moment, even though she was still behind her sunglasses, I noticed a tear falling, which made the moment feel even more painful because it was one of the few visible signs that she was also struggling with what was happening. After that, we separated and went our own ways, and that was the last time we saw each other. After that meeting, everything just went silent between us. No messages, no calls, no check-ins, nothing at all. Just radio silence that came immediately after such an emotionally heavy ending. And it felt strange how quickly someone who was part of my daily life disappeared into complete absence, and I am still here, trying to make sense of it, still trying to understand how something that felt so consistent, so loving, and so present could reach a point where it ended so suddenly, without any clear warning that I could recognize in time. The hardest part has not only been the breakup itself, but the way my mind keeps replaying everything that led up to it, especially the moments where she seemed secure and loving, just days before everything changed, because it makes it very difficult for me to understand what shifted internally for her in such a short period of time. I keep thinking about the engagement earlier in the year, and how happy she seemed in that moment, and how real it felt for both of us at the time. And I keep trying to reconcile that version of her with the version of her who ended the relationship, while saying her mind felt numb and unclear. It creates a kind of emotional contradiction that I still have not fully resolved in my head. What makes it even harder is the gap between how connected we were in daily life and how suddenly that connection stopped. Because going from constant communication, voice messages, video calls, and emotional presence to absolute silence feels almost unreal when experienced directly. It is not just missing a person, but also missing the entire structure of daily life that was built around that person. And suddenly, that structure is gone without transition. Right now, I am still in the phase where I am not fully able to accept what happened. Not because I do not understand the fact that the relationship is over, but because emotionally, it still feels like I am caught between what we were and what suddenly became reality. There are moments where I feel like I am slowly understanding it, and then moments where it feels like it just happened yesterday again. Even after everything that happened, even after the silence and the distance and the ending that I did not expect, what remains most strongly is the feeling that I genuinely miss her, not just as a partner, but as someone who was part of my everyday life in a way that felt deeply familiar and real. And that is what makes this so difficult to move through, because the absence is not just emotional, but also habitual, and I am still learning how to exist in that absence without fully understanding how it all changed so quickly. One of the things my mind keeps doing over and over again is trying to locate a specific moment where things might have started to shift, as if there was a hidden turning point that I somehow missed, because it is very difficult to accept that something so significant could feel so sudden without a clear and visible reason that I could recognize at the time. I keep going back to the days just before the breakup, trying to replay conversations, messages, and even small emotional cues, searching for something that would explain how we went from daily affection, engagement, and emotional closeness to complete emotional withdrawal in such a short time. But every time I do that, I end up in the same place, which is that nothing obvious stands out as a warning sign that I was able to fully understand in the moment. What hurts the most, when I think about it now, is the contrast between how loving she was in her messages and how overwhelmed she seemed right before the breakup, because it feels like two completely different emotional states that existed very close to each other in time. There was a version of her who told me I was the only man she ever loved and who expressed deep emotional attachment. And then there was a version of her who, only days later, said her mind felt numb and that she no longer understood what she was feeling or why she was making certain decisions. That contrast is something I still struggle to emotionally reconcile, because both versions felt real at the time. The phone call before everything ended is something I keep returning to in my memory, not because it was dramatic in an obvious way, but because of how emotionally heavy it felt in a quiet and subtle way that I did not fully understand in the moment. She was not angry or blaming me during that call, but instead she was blaming herself, saying things that made it sound like she felt unworthy or like she was failing in some way. And there was a kind of emotional exhaustion in her voice that felt very different from her usual tone. I remember trying to stay calm and present for her, because that felt like the only thing I could do in that moment, not realizing that it would end up being one of the last meaningful interactions we had before the breakup. What makes the timeline feel even more confusing is how quickly things moved from emotional intensity to silence, because it feels like there was no gradual fading or slow distance between us, but instead a sudden drop from connection into absence. It is hard to process how a conversation that involved deep emotions and vulnerability could be followed so quickly by a decision to end the relationship entirely, especially when there was still a sense of care present in her voice during that last call. That sudden shift is something I still do not fully understand. When she told me she does not want the relationship anymore, It did not feel like a message that came from anger, conflict, or even detachment in the usual sense, but rather from a place of emotional confusion and numbness that she herself could not fully explain. She expressed that she wants to stay where she currently lives and that she cannot continue the relationship, while also apologizing deeply, which made it feel like she was struggling with her own decision even as she was making it. It did not feel simple or straightforward, and that complexity is part of what makes it hard to fully process. The day we met to exchange belongings felt heavier than I expected, not because of anything dramatic happening, but because of how quiet and emotionally restrained everything was between us. Compared to how things used to be, there was no arguing, no long explanations, no emotional closure conversation, just a kind of silence that filled the space where our usual connection used to be. Seeing her like that, with sunglasses on and minimal words, made the reality of the situation feel more concrete in a way that messages alone never could. The moment she cried while we hugged goodbye is something that keeps replaying in my mind because it felt like one of the only moments where the emotional weight of the situation became physically visible. Even though she tried to stay composed during the meeting, that single tear made it clear that this was not something easy for her either. Even if she had already made the decision to leave the relationship, that moment stayed with me longer than anything else from that day. After she walked away, there was no continuation, no follow-up message, and no attempt to reconnect. Just complete silence that started immediately after that final meeting. It felt strange how quickly someone who had been part of my daily emotional life for so long could turn into complete absence, not because of a fight or gradual distance, but because of a decision made in a very emotionally unclear state. That silence has been difficult to adjust to because it feels so absolute. Right now, I am still living with a lot of unanswered questions, not necessarily about what happened factually, but about what was happening internally for her that led to such a sudden emotional shift, because I know I may never fully understand that part. There are moments where I accept that some things do not come with clear explanations, and other moments where I still find myself searching for meaning in every detail that came before the breakup. It is an ongoing internal conflict between acceptance and confusion. At this point, what remains is not just the memory of the relationship itself, but the emotional imprint of someone who was deeply present in my daily life, suddenly becoming completely absent, and that absence still feels very real in my everyday routine. Even though the relationship has ended, the emotional connection does not disappear instantly, and I am still learning how to live in a space where someone who used to be part of everything is no longer there at all. And despite everything that happened, I still miss her in a way that is difficult to put into words, because it is not only about the relationship we had, but also about the life rhythm we built together over time that suddenly stopped without warning. Even now, there are moments where the situation still does not fully feel real to me, not in the sense that I do not understand what happened factually, but in the sense that my emotional perception of it has not fully caught up with reality. It still feels like something that is temporarily silent, like a pause that will eventually resolve itself, even though logically, I know that is not the case anymore. That disconnect between understanding and feeling is one of the hardest parts to live with right now. What I find myself struggling with the most is the lack of clear emotional closure, not because she owed me an explanation beyond what she already gave, but because the way things ended felt so emotionally unclear and sudden that my mind keeps trying to fill in the gaps on its own. There was no long final conversation where everything was fully unpacked, no gradual emotional unwinding, just a very sudden shift from connection to separation and then silence. That kind of ending makes it difficult for the mind to fully settle. I keep replaying the last version of her I saw in person, standing there with sunglasses on, speaking in short sentences, trying to remain composed, while clearly carrying something heavy internally, because that version of her feels like the final imprint I have of who she was at the end of everything, and then I contrast that with all the earlier versions of her, the one who sent good morning voice messages, the one who laughed during calls, the one who shared reels and said she felt deeply connected to me. And it becomes difficult to understand how all of those versions existed in the same timeline that ended the way it did. After everything ended, the silence that followed became something I had to slowly learn to sit with, even though at first it felt unbearable, because there is no longer any natural communication rhythm to fall back into. No daily messages, no calls, no small check-ins. At first, that silence felt like something I needed to break. But over time, I realized that it is not something that will be filled again in the same way. And that realization is something I am still adjusting to emotionally. It is not easy, but it is slowly becoming part of reality. At this point, I do not have a clear conclusion or resolution to the story, because there was no neat, emotional ending that tied everything together. Only a relationship that was very real, very loving in many ways, and then suddenly ended in a way that I still do not fully understand. What remains is the memory of what we had, the routine we built, the emotional closeness we shared, and the sudden absence that followed it all. And even though I am still trying to process it day by day, I know that what I felt was real, and what we had meant something to both of us in its own way, even if it ultimately could not continue. For now, I am just learning how to live with the silence that came after someone who was once part of everything is no longer there anymore.